Hello, this is Tuesday, March 26, 2019. This is the SIG architecture conformance subproject. We have a brand new agenda. This is the first inaugural meeting, for lack of a better term. I will put the meeting minutes in chat. If you could add your details there, that would be highly beneficial. Just as a reminder, we have a code of conduct. So please adhere to the code of conduct, because this video will be recorded in posterity and shared on YouTube forever and ever for everyone to see, including your grandmother. So the first item I had up on the list, and I'll share my screen here to walk through the backlog details. All right, so first up, Administrivia. We currently have a project board, but we have stuff that's kind of flying all over the place. And I don't know whether or not the project board resembles reality. What I found in multiple project boards, and I don't know if this is true for everything, so I'd like people to give me their hot takes, is that you have to manage the project boards. So if stuff flows in randomly from the wild and gets the labels appropriately set, does stuff become inbound to the project board, or do you have to manage the project board and the inbound separately?
I can speak to my experience having interacted with it. I'm very curious who else uses it. I will periodically go to the add card section and use a query that ensures label area conformance is one of the criteria. I move literally everything over to the to triage column. I then walk the board backwards if I'm doing a review scrub. So I start with anything in the in review column to see if any of my feedback has been acted upon, or if there's anything that could use feedback from me. If anything looks, if it's an issue that has to do with promoting a test to conformance and it looks good to me, I'll drop an LGTM label and I will move it forward to the needs approval column. I then generally look at any other PRs in any of the previous columns, and I try to review it. And if I review it, I move it to the in review column. I don't really touch any of the issues or any of the other columns. And I have set the board up so that if an issue or a PR is closed, it automatically moves to the done column. That's how I use it.
Okay. Are folks using this other than Aaron? And actively triaging?
I use it. I typically look at the needs approval column, and especially if I get poked, then I'll do it urgently. If I don't get poked by some means other than GitHub notifications, then I try to pull it once a week or so, although in the past couple of weeks I haven't done that because I wanted to let some things pile up so that we could go over them as a group, go through the process.
Whoever's the loud typer, could you please mute? I think it is, I don't know who it is.
It's me, I'm so sorry. I forgot, sorry.
But yes. Or if things get sent my way, I'll try to make sure that they're in the board. I think some other people helped to populate the to triage board as well with a bunch of issues that previously were in spreadsheets and whatnot. So having it kind of all in one place, I find helpful. I agree that without automation, it's kind of tedious. Most of the issues are in, if anybody's typing, please mute. Most of the issues are in Kubernetes. If there are tests to get promoted to conformance, or if there are changes to existing conformance tests. But occasionally there are some things in other repos, especially the community repo, if it's documentation related to conformance testing, as an example. So not everything is all in one repo, but it's mostly in a couple of repos. So
yeah, the problem is this spreading of some of the information of how the promotion of conformance gets automatically applied. So as long as we do PRs and it gets the label attached to them, you can do the query properly. But there's ways, will it force this update to this directory every time something gets promoted, or only after it does the generation piece?
So PRs that touch the data file that has the list of conformance tests will automatically have area conformance applied to them.
Okay, that, as long as it's tenable through automation.
Well, but so hang on, because literally everything else is manually applied. So if it's about updating docs related to conformance, we expect people to add the area conformance to their PR. If it's umbrella or tracking issues, we expect people to apply the label there. The really tricky one is if somebody is modifying an existing test case, which is already in the list of conformance, you have to, whoever is reviewing that has to notice that conformance is involved, you know, it's a conformance in function or something, and be diligent enough to apply the label and say, hey, wait, hang on, you're modifying a test that is a conformance test. Let's make sure you're not adding any new checking or behavior or whatever that is prohibited by the list of conformance requirements. One good example of this that I believe I have teed up for us is talking about DNS, because there's splitting up DNS that's verifying PQDNs and FQDNs and whether or not this works on Windows versus Linux and all that good fun stuff. There was no automation that would have applied the area conformance label to that.
Yeah, so that's where we either more automation could help, or restructuring the organization of the tests to leverage existing automation could help.
One of, like, the tricky thing there is our ownership and labeling mechanisms are very hierarchical. So if we want to say that like SIG Apps is in charge of all of the workload related tests because SIG Apps owns all the workload controllers, great. But then there's a subset of those workload tests that are also conformance tests. Do we expect that to be split out into a brand new directory called conformance, or, you know, how do we organize things to enable that to happen?
Well, this dovetails with a lot of the other work in testing commons. We were even talking about restructuring some pieces. And I think step one, do an audit. Step two, evaluate commonality of structure if it makes sense. But right now, I think it's on me currently to do an audit anyways, because there's a lot of changes we want to make, and the problem is prioritizing what changes come first. And what are the most important things to try and get a DAG flow that ripples down properly. Because some of the changes that people want to make inside the end-to-end test currently, if they don't come in a specific order, you're gonna end up doing a ton more work because of the problems of dependencies. So I will happily go through and audit what's currently there and probably have that by next time. I know that Brian wanted to do a walkthrough. Brian, did you want to do that today? It wasn't on the agenda.
Yeah, I did want to at least say some things about it. I can actually only stay for another 10 minutes or so. But I don't know if I have time to do the walkthrough this week.
Okay.
I did want to say that when we're looking at a test, to probably bring one up like the one that Aaron mentioned. You know, it looks like there are a couple ones related to that, either in review or needs approval column. I can just pick one, any test that's promoting something to conformance. Yeah, so if you look at the changes there, some of these are quite subtle and some of them are not. Mm-hmm. But my general advice would be, if you're not a domain expert, please call in domain experts from the relevant SIG. You can ask the SIG chair or SIG TL to find someone to actually review, because sometimes seemingly innocuous changes can totally change the meaning of the test. So please do call in a domain expert. And it's not just sufficient to determine necessarily what is being covered by the test and whether that should be covered by conformance. Like you would say, oh yeah, definitely whether this pod is working correctly should be covered by conformance. But you actually also have to look at how is it testing that, because there are certain behaviors that are not guaranteed to be portable or stable. So you actually need to look at what mechanism is it using to evaluate that behavior. Obviously we care about things like, is the test stable? Is it flaky? This is why we normally ask tests to be run for a while first as end-to-end tests before promoting them to conformance to make sure they're well behaved. Sometimes that can surface differences between different providers as well if they run for a while on different providers, but at least it will determine whether they're stable or flaky. But we've had some cases where some tests have looked at, say, event contents or other aspects that are not guaranteed to be portable, or have used specific container images that are not really portable. So some of that stuff can get pretty hairy. The general advice there would be, if you're not sure, and it's not really covered by the officially documented conformance test criteria in the community repo, just raise the issue and ask for guidance for other people. And if we come up with some new general principle to apply to the conformance test, we should add it to the documentation just to make it obvious to other people who are reviewing the test in the future.
So we have a very small number of reviewers in this list, and I haven't even seen MML in the community for a very long time. Should we, and he's listed as approver, should we revise this list currently with people who are on the call, who are well-established people who want to, be part of this process?
We should. Yeah, there were some people involved in early on as we were implementing or updating how the conformance suite automation worked. So that's why MML was in that list. You're right. As far as I know, he's not working on this currently. We did have a number of volunteers to help with the review process. I can't see everybody who's on the call, but
there's a lot of people on the call. They should have access to the document. So I think the approvers has to earn their stripes, but I think reviewers, I think it's good to have multiple reviewers on this.
Yes, I agree.
So if folks want to volunteer for reviewers, please add the details to the docs, and I would happily do a PR after this meeting to just update that list of reviewers and modify it. You're not even listed here as approvers, Brian.
Yeah, I'm some other category.
It's listed as an approver just for the conformance test data, right? Like listing yourself as a reviewer in a directory called conformance doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be automatically applied as a reviewer on any PR that has the area conformance label. Because again, that label can't really be automatically applied to any PR except those that touch the conformance test list, which that is where Brian is an approver.
Yeah, and we could add some special automation for that. Like for a while, we had automation about if you touch types.go files, then it gets labeled as an API change. If a file that contains some conformance code were touched by someone, we could automatically label that. But we don't have a way to connect labels to automatic reviewer assignment right now, as far as I know.
Correct.
Okay. So if folks are on the list, if folks are on the call and want to be added to that list, please update your details inside the document. We can PR at least that directory underneath here.
Do we have anything that's capturing coverage data for the EDE test binary?
Yes. But it's kind of wonky, and it's unclear to me whether we want to talk about coverage data at this meeting right now today.
Yeah,
well, I'm not saying coverage goals. I'm saying you could use that to identify if a block that has been marked as conformance has been changed.
Okay, I see what you're talking about. No, we don't have support for that at the moment.
Okay.
So I think like people who are interested in updating our tooling to support that kind of functionality, those are the people that should be in the owner's file in the conformance directory. There's like some bit of code there that walks all of the files and looks at what they're doing syntactically. And I think we've talked about, could we maybe update that to lint some of our conformance tests to make sure that they don't do some of the things that we know we don't want them to do, to ease some reviewer burden. So I think there's lots of stuff we could do to improve our tooling, and that's a great place for that. I feel like review bandwidth for all of the conformance tests separately, like putting those names in that owners file, will help with that.
Yeah, I think we had talked about, I mean, that seems like something more to talk about tomorrow in the meeting, the tooling updates. I think we really wanted to make sure this focused on increasing the reviewer bandwidth, so going over how to do the reviews as opposed to updating process.
Your first statement said your first statement said having extra bandwidth, but that matters too. You need more resources to make that possible. So you need A and B. They're not mutually exclusive. But I agree with the sentiment.
Yeah. I'm just saying this particular meeting, we should probably try and keep focused on making sure, educating people, including me, on how to go through out and do this, go about and do this, as opposed to how do we update the tooling to assign things automatically or change the way we track things.
Yeah. So the most common thing that people do is they change it from a it to a conformance it, and they update the modification for what is the current test. But before you can go through the promotion, you need to evaluate. I mean, if we want to increase coverage and get better coverage for existing behavior that we currently have, there's probably a test for most of the core things that matter. But like Brian said, understanding the implications of what it means and making sure that we're applying all the semantics. So before I just blindly promoted this individual test, I asked a question, right? So this is a common case of most of the PRs that we're seeing. Most of the PRs that we're seeing inbound are basically, we're going to take this test that we've had for a long time, which basically tests that you have shared volume between containers, and we're going to promote it to be a full conformance test. And the question I had was that this leverages empty dir, right? And the question I had was, what does empty dir mean on Windows? And I even have more questions of how to share volumes between containers work on Windows, because I don't actually know the answer to those questions without me actually going through the details of the doc. So I just wanted to ask some questions here first, and there was some response back. And then it said, if it's ignored, why is it not Linux only? So I think the one thing that Brian tried to stress earlier on, I don't know if he's still in the call, was that to make sure that we go through the due diligence of promotion and ask all the questions up front.
Yeah, it could be like in this case, you got a response from someone from SIG Windows, which is great. There's also a KEP that goes into gory detail on what Windows does and doesn't support and why. And that can be used, if you're interested in doing more reviews of Windows related things in the future, it would be good to have some more domain experts read up on that and build up their knowledge. I just posted a link to the conformance test documentation, which includes some of the criteria and whatnot. Empty dir is a good example where that's a feature that should be portable, or at least in all cases was obviously portable until Windows came along, except there are certain properties that might not be, like you can request memory medium empty dir, so effectively RAM, a RAM disk, and that's an example of one thing that's not supported on Windows. So for all the tests,
Brian, if I interrupt, sorry. In this particular case, so was it? I think that the comment from the Windows SIG was that an empty dir works fine, but this medium memory doesn't. Is this test setting medium memory? And if it is, would we split that then into two tests? One that tests the basic empty dir or the basic shared volume functionality, and then if we want to test memory, which is almost more of a unit test for the volume driver.
Yeah, so that's a good question. We already went through a ton of these, and for every case where it exercised some functionality that wasn't available in Windows, like medium equals memory, we documented the reason why the test didn't work on Windows, and we tagged it Linux only. We did not do the next step of, well, maybe we should have a Windows test, and part of the reason for that was Windows is not covered by conformance, but we would like Windows to be tested, right? So many of these tests don't adequately describe what they're trying to test. So some reverse engineering needs to happen, or we need to go back to the author of the test to figure out what were we really trying to test. Some of them are somewhat non-obvious. Some of them also reuse code to make it easier to stand up various test fixtures. And they're exercising functionality that they don't actually test. So some of those things we may need to clean up. We haven't really done that level of detail just because we have so much uncovered stuff. We've been mostly going more brute force, trying to increase coverage over things that obviously need to be covered as opposed to refining that set. But at some point we will want to go through that next level of detail and do that.
A question I had with regards to like the Windows work, because this overlaps with the conversation, is a lot of the existing tests use Linux specific containers. And some of the Windows tests use Windows Server 2019-ish based style containers. So the question I have is, if we are going to promote things that would apply to this multi-OS deployment, does it matter to make sure that you're running Windows Server containers, or is there a generic base that we should be basing the images on?
You want to answer that, Patrick?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the right solution is that for ones that are, for containers that are used in conformance tests, we should make sure that we get a multi-arc image published for them. And so we've done that for many of them. BusyBox is one example, where we've got a Windows equivalent for that runs BusyBox, and we're using I can't remember the layer. It's not Sigwin. It's one of the others. But basically, we've got something that is an analog to that. But those are not merged back into the Kubernetes /test/images folder yet. And so I think that part of how we're going to get conformance profiles done and separate out which ones are OS and architecture agnostic from which ones are a profile that's more restrictive in what nodes it applies to. We need to get that list of multi-arc ones done and get them built. But I don't have a timeline for that yet. That's something we're talking about as part of 15.
Yeah, so even before we get the profiles officially defined and have Windows tests officially part of conformance, we do want as many of the tests as possible to be able to run on Windows. And we want to, I'd say, prevent accidental accumulation of more tests that can't run on Windows. So I view that as sort of a specific sub-effort that will need to be undertaken by a set of people to try to figure out mechanically what do we need to do and have in place to ensure that we don't get even farther behind there. Yeah.
If there's like a checklist for or an umbrella issue, is there a checklist or an umbrella issue that folks on this call can track along with? So as we're doing reviews, we can start to take a look and evaluate that checklist and make sure we mature it over time, because this clearly opens up a bunch of questions with regards to multi-arch. Or multi-OS. It's not necessarily Arch.
Well, speaking of multi-arch, in theory, I think most of the tests can run on multiple architectures, but in practice, I'm not aware of any providers that have certified that are not x86, although I could easily be wrong. I don't know if K3S certified x86 or ARM.
I do know that ARM does pass because people have gone through the effort. So they fixed that stuff along the way.
I feel like we have ARM results showing up on test grid somewhere under a SIG-Node dashboard.
Yeah, I can confirm that.
Okay.
Also, PowerPC 64LE.
So I have to run, but I think something that would be great to do is to try to figure out the most effective way of onboarding the new reviewers. Maybe picking some less tricky test and going over that, since Aaron looked at a bunch of the ones in the in review column. Maybe pick one of those and walk through how you did the review and what questions got asked, and see if it can be moved to the needs approval column.
Okay. Is there any of the last questions that folks want to ask of Brian before he takes off? Going once, twice.
Yeah. Again, I'll just say the number one way, biggest thing that will help fanning out this effort is people to just feel comfortable asking someone else for help when they're not sure, and then writing down the answer somewhere if it seems generally applicable.
And where is the right place to ask that? My vote would be for Slack, but where do you think?
Well, I don't monitor Slack unless people ping me explicitly. But sometimes it's good. You're going to be asking domain experts, so that's going to depend on the area of the test. And sometimes you're going to be asking about general conformance criteria, and that would be SIGArch. Mailing list would be my preference, but
how about like a standard promotional model? Like the people who are monitoring K8's conformance, like that's the standard channel that we kind of use for this effort. And if it doesn't, if we say we don't have an answer, then we should go to the list.
That's fine.
Agree.
Yeah, and again, if it's something that seems general and not covered by the documentation, send a PR to update the criteria.
Okay. Do we have a link inside of here for the current criteria, especially around Windows?
Windows criteria are not documented because they haven't been part of conformance.
Okay.
I dropped the link.
Criteria, there's conformance test requirements that the link was just up there. Is that where we would add additional?
Yes.
Yeah.
That would be my suggestion.
All right. So we have a bunch of action items. I think for folks who are on the call for being new to this effort, taking a look at the requirements, we'll try to update the owner's file with people who are experienced in updating, and we'll walk through an example. Does that seem like a reasonable next steps right now?
That sounds good to me. The one other thing I just wanted to point out for who do we contact when or whatever, when it comes time for a PR it looks good to me. I want somebody like Brian or Clayton, the only two people right now who can approve the promotion of a test to conformance. I try to use the conformance mailing list, and I point them at the needs approval column. So I try to get the needs approval column loaded up with PRs that I think are ready for their approval, and then I notify the mailing list.
That seems reasonable. I definitely batch it.
Yep.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
So quick question. So you talked about a review checklist. Is this conformance test requirements link the place that you want the review checklist to be, or is that a different doc?
I think adding it there makes a ton of sense, because if we just have one-stop shopping for the details of what the conformance tests are and just modify that doc, that would probably be helpful, and we can just use that at the top. We could even have it to the top of this document as like, here are the main documents that we use as part of our evaluation. Did that answer your question, Patrick?
Yeah. And so who is going to take the first action on adding that section? Because I want to make sure I get the list of, here's things that you should watch out for if you have questions around whether or not it's going to work on Windows, and here's the right way to contact somebody to get a second review on it to get that clarified.
If you see me smiling, that usually means if you're talking the most about a particular content area, that means you're the person to do the job.
Well, yeah, I'm willing to add the Windows section, but I wasn't sure whether or not you or Brian had another checklist in mind. It's just a PR ordering problem.
I think the checklist for Windows is the one that I asked the question on.
Okay.
I think there is enough details from the last time I looked at this that outlined what were the criteria.
Okay.
And we did the review last time, and we wanted to refine it even more.
Okay.
So I think we can audit that and update as necessary and talk about it in this conversation too.
Okay.
Yeah, as an action item for this group, I highly recommend reading this list. If you feel that there's something missing or that needs modification, feel free to make a PR, and then we'll talk about it during the next call. Does that seem fair?
Yes. My only ask is that we iterate on changes to this document faster than we have in the past. It took me 2 months to get this checklist looking like it does now.
Okay. Yeah, the other thing here is there are some notes that was added by Claudio in some of the conformance tests. Maybe that can be used to seed this checklist, right?
Yeah. That seems fair.
Okay. I'll get an issue open on that, and then I'll talk with Claudio and see which one of us will start that PR, because he may, or I don't know if he was going to try to join the call tomorrow, I think. I don't know.
I am here.
Oh, you are here. Okay. Did you want to start the first PR on that, or should I take a first try at it?
Yeah, you can add me as an action there for that.
Okay.
What's your email address?
It's patrick.lang@microsoft.com.
.lang?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Brian asked for us to walk through an in review and see if we can get it to needs approval, just for us to have the example. Does that seem like a good next step, or are there other things that folks want to discuss before going through that?
I thought he had asked maybe if there was something in the in approval column, if we could talk about how it got to the in approval column, but I'm like fine with either, whatever.
All right. I'm in the driver's seat. So.
Not that one.
not this one?
Yeah. So, and the reason I say not that one, just to try and maybe scope this meeting, I feel like this meeting isn't the place we should be trying to scope out what validation suites are and how they differ from overall conformance tests and whatnot. I feel like this is about how can we most effectively shepherd forward reviews of conformance tests and promoting conformance tests. I think those other discussions best take place either at SIG architecture or at the conformance working group, the CNCF conformance working group meeting tomorrow.
Yep. All right, so promote container runtime E2E verifying termination message. I think I looked at this one. So let's take a look at it here real quick. First part is that test conformance data, which is, I'm hoping it's all automated for what it rips through the conformance it. That was the changes that MML made a long time ago. So it takes a look at what's been changed in conformance it, and then it basically plops that data into this. So it'll raise the bar or signal every time that we see an update here. And Kenichi commented here, should report termination, there's a space missing here, or extra space, from long output of termination message policy, fallbacks to logs and errors set. Is it fine to not contain Linux only for this list? I don't know. Let's take a look at the test. So first thing you notice is that we have this sort of update, which the time frame is now elapsed. So one thing that happened last cycle, which I was not a fan of, is that there was a bunch of updates that happened really close to the end of cycle. I don't know if anyone else noticed that. I saw that everyone tried to push things into 1.14 at the end. I think pushing conformance should happen at the beginning of the cycle where possible. And during that last 2 weeks, it should be totally quiescent. Like, we should not try to promote anything in, like, even 2 weeks, or maybe up to code freeze if it's really important. But it's better to err on the side of being conservative on promotion, in my opinion.
Tim, we did hold the line on code freeze just before code freeze. I don't think anybody added after code freeze.
I agree with Tim, though. This is before code freeze. I don't think the last 2 weeks of a release are the time to change the conformance definition of a release. It creates a bunch of other challenges for people qualifying, and it's the worst possible time to change the definition of what Kubernetes is. And I also like features going into a 1.15 release. We haven't really had this discussion before, but I would prefer that we don't mark features as part of conformance that are going into GA in a release unless we've done some kind of prep work. So I agree with Tim, maybe for some slightly different reason.
Clayton, I think I'm trying to remember. The feature that is going in, we don't immediately mark things as conformance because we want the conformance test to kind of like soak in for some time before we promote to conformance, right? So it will get caught in that loop and wait,
Well,
basically.
I think we added to the CAP process that any GA, non-optional GA feature being promoted to GA needs a conformance test.
And we haven't really stuck to that, have we?
Well, we just
haven't enforced that yet, but we could if we so choose.
Right.
Once it's GA, what more soak do we need, right? We should already be soaked at that point.
Oh, right. This is like adding a new test to support that going to GA.
So,
right?
Speaking as a former release lead, I don't want to see the addition of a bunch of new tests right at the end. I've gotten used to watching all of the CI signal generated by the existing tests. So if you want to place an additional, if you want to like slightly change the name of a test or add a tag that says conformance, I think I'm fine with that. But if you start writing a whole bunch of brand new tests, like that absolutely doesn't fly during code freeze. In the run up to code freeze, I don't know. It's a tougher call for me to be so firm on because people oftentimes need to are fleshing out their feature and testing their feature simultaneously to try and land before code freeze.
Right. Then the question is, do we want to move the deadline for conformance even before? And that's the
question here. Like, what's the rush to promote something to conformance? Like, I think that I would agree with the general goals. We want tests for the conformance. We want stable tests for the conformance. I feel like we should not create a sense of urgency about promoting conformance tests because it's part of the release process. I feel like it's the good tests are part of the release process and having good signal from them. And conformance is an additional step where we are growing the definition of Kubernetes. It doesn't necessarily follow to me that just because something's GA that it is officially part of Kubernetes.
I almost feel like, Clayton, what you are saying is there is a fourth level of enhancement or feature stability or whatever. It's alpha, beta, GA, certified conformant.
Should someone on this call potentially do a PR to the release timeframe and punch list to sort of call out explicitly and say we will not promote after this, 2 weeks before code freeze or something like that? Call it conformance freeze.
I mean, I think that's a great idea. I mean, like the other reason that I was so worried about this is like there's just a lot of stuff going on at the end of the release that's more important. Is getting out a good Kubernetes release is the most important thing. I want to not add pressure to the review and end of release process to change the definition of Kubernetes. It feels like we can do that as a two-phase commit. But I would totally agree with you, Tim.
Okay, so are we saying that, say, when we are cutting the beta 1, that's the time when we are going to close the door for conformance tests, the promotion? Because right now we have marked it as code freeze. And beta 1 would be like 2 weeks before that. Anybody disagree?
I think it should be created. I think the deadline for the conformance test should be before the new branch for the future release is created.
Yeah, branch creations. I'm kind of against the addition of new phases or additional complexity or subtlety to the release cycle because people get confused really easily. So I think having the creation of the branch is probably a good time to pin a deadline to.
We updated the doc, or at least Dims and I did, or Dims did upon the other conversation we had where he said nothing past code freeze.
So I view there are two groups of people we're talking to here. there are the groups of people here who are reviewing conformance tests and approves and stuff. And so like, if you don't review things, then they're not going to land in the release, and that's great. But from the perspective of where do people invest their time and energy, we don't want people investing their time and energy in these tests. So how do you communicate that prior to code freeze?
Well, I think that's this group. That's the whole purpose of everybody on this call. We talk about it openly. So we kind of bike shedded quite a bit here. Perhaps we should have an action item to follow up on it and take a look at what the current documentation says. And see if we need to
so we should
anything.
just 3422. Let's talk there, because right now that's still in flight.
Yeah. Right. So let's take a look at this test and exactly what it does. So create a pod with n container. Container's output is recorded in the log, and container exits with an error. When the container is terminated, termination message must match the expected output recorded from the container's log. The grammar of this sentence drives me a little crazy, but that's okay. Does anyone think, from reading that description, besides the fact that the test itself might be Linux specific, think that that should be a Linux only test?
So what we had mentioned in several other PRs was when somebody's adding a Linux only tag, then they should say why exactly this is Linux only, and that's not being done here.
Well, wouldn't Windows support the same thing?
Right.
It's the overall question is unanswered to me. I do know that the Linux only label was applied to a lot of things, but I don't necessarily know if they truly are Linux only. Right?
I think Brian caught a lot of those, and I think whatever has been marked Linux only already has a description of why it's Linux only.
As far as I know, almost all of the Linux-only tests have comments. For example, just one line below, as you can see, there's a comment, cannot mount files in Windows containers.
Right, but Claudia, we said
typically for the conformance tests, that description is included in the comment, in the description that you're trying to edit right now.
Correct. It should be part of the description itself. Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Are there other comments about this test? It's a fairly straightforward, pretty simple test.
So real quick, do we have the right, and this is more a meta question, I just want to be 100% certain, do we have the right process for ensuring that things that are marked Linux only in conformance have a prioritization and an urgency to make sure that they're on Windows? Like, what's the meta process around that? Are we comfortable with it? Because just like when you brought this up, Tim, this should absolutely be required behavior of every Kubernetes system. Like when this went in, like they went in for a reason. So that sort of gap is important to make sure we have the right checks and balances on.
Yeah, Clayton, I didn't catch that. Sorry, can you say that again?
So I look at this and I think the fact that this only works on Linux is breaking a fairly fundamental part of a Kubernetes system. And so it just means that this is a bug that Windows does not support this. And so I'm trying to make sure that we have I just want to use this as a checkpoint. Do we have a good process that ensures that, say, Windows adequately prioritize when they're not actually fulfilling the goal of Q, for instance?
Right. I think, Patrick, wasn't that covered in the KEP that you would do Linux only for things that will never be supported by Windows?
Yeah, we did. It did. But the question that is here is whether or not the test itself, the behavior and how the test executes, could that be modified so that to ensure that this statement still is true? So I think the problem here is that the statement of what it's saying and it's the implementation details of how it's actually done might be two different things.
Yeah. I see. I think here it was the single file cannot be mounted or something like that.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, there's several Windows ones that fail for that same reason, but as I understand it, that's actually in progress in Windows to make that possible. Is that correct?
It's something that we're working on, but I can't give a specific date on it yet. We need to migrate over to Containerd, and then depending on the situation, there may also need to be a future Windows release to fix that. And so it's something that's being tracked, but I can't tag it with a particular milestone yet.
And is it unreasonable for us to put that supporting tracking info in this to some degree? Like, should we require breadcrumbs from the conformance commit and conformance description back to an overarching issue that identifies the implementation gaps when it is something that should be implemented but isn't versus can never be implemented?
Is there a section in the CAP with this information? Maybe we can put a link to that.
The link to the CAP would probably be work for me.
I mean, so I guess the could be versus never is a very difficult distinction to make, because if it's something that requires a change in Windows and you're looking at a ship cycle that might be 6 months to 2 years away, I mean, do we want to just have an issue that's open for the next 2 years?
Well, we've had no problem having issues open for the last 5 years. So what's an extra 2 for some folks? I might, and maybe a link to an issue isn't appropriate, but maybe a discussion of the limitation is appropriate, because ultimately this comment is the recording of a decision about what is Kubernetes. And I do think that deserves a little bit more ceremony. And it maybe doesn't have to be to an issue, but it has to be a discussion of why and what it's waiting for or something like that.
So I think this starts to get more into the stuff maybe we need to talk about tomorrow or another meeting.
As long as we can queue that up. It was a good example for me.
Yeah. No, there's similar ones in the networking space, right? We have similar things that's like, well, this really should probably work, but it can't right now. And so should those be conformance tests that are Linux only or not? And I think that Windows right now is an optional feature. It's not actually subject to conformance in the same way. So in some ways, what we're trying to do is adapt the conformance test so that Windows can say it passes conformance when it doesn't technically need to pass conformance. So it's a little bit, circular, I think. In any case, probably not for this call.
So how many of these reasons do we have, John, right now? There's like 6 or 8 of these reasons that we mark Linux only?
The ones I know about are, right, if there's some things around partially qualified domain name lookups, there's if host network is not supported, and that is required for some things like pod to node communication, I believe it was. So there's a few like underlying things. So we can't mount a file, can't do host networking.
Privileged containers.
Privileged containers. Okay, so yeah, those must be in the CAP.
Yeah, they're in the CAP, and I just added a link in here, but we've got those documented over on docs.k8s.io as well.
A good kind of rule is that if it has anything with security context in it, they probably won't work.
What about network capability, or rather PCAP type stuff?
Can you repeat?
So capabilities for processes as opposed to, is that part of security context? So like if I want to
it is.
Okay.
Okay. So one thing that I could take as an action item onto this too is to understand why the behavior of this requires a single file mounted into a container. I don't see why it should. It says should report termination message from log output if termination message apology fallback to logs on error is set.
Termination message path. Getting its termination message from a file specifically. And so I assume that file has to be mounted.
Is that the specific functionality? I don't know this functionality.
From what I saw, that's what kubelet does.
That's the functionality of the kubelet implementation, yes.
Yeah. Even doing a Docker inspect will reveal that a single file is being mounted in the container, inspecting a Linux container.
And so the file is initially created but empty on the node. It's mounted in the container, and then the expectation is that the container writes to it. Is that what's going on here?
Yeah, pretty much.
Right.
And so that way the file system watcher on that could be run on that file on the host, or on the node rather.
Yep, that should be it.
Yeah.
So if I can go back to the meta point, I feel like just the sheer fact that we put Linux only in the tag and it's also a conformance test should be priority enough. And I feel like the discussion of looking at the list of conformance tests and how many of them are marked Linux only is a SIG Windows problem. If they want to get to a world where a cluster with Windows nodes is certified as conformant, we need to cycle through that list and figure out how do we make it smaller, whether that's trying to re-implement the test in a way that it doesn't leverage Linux-specific functionality, or whether we need to consider whether that dovetails off into the whole validation versus conformance problem or whatnot. But I feel like doing a lot of that upfront analysis here maybe not worth our while.
Yeah, I think for the first time, we should not bike shit on this repeatedly, but I think for the first time, getting people on the same page seems reasonable. But I do think this needs to be documented in gory detail. So that way, every time you actually list out the Linux only portion, it can go to a link that lands on a page. So it actually has a description of why. Because right now, it is totally unclear to me, without the knowledge from Patrick and I think Claudio, I had no idea why this description alone did not give me enough insight into why it does not behave that way on Windows. But when we talked about it out loud, and Dims and Patrick gave the gory details, it does make more sense.
So I'm sorry, I need to understand. Aaron, were you saying that, let me clarify what I think, and maybe the opposite of what you're saying. So I was thinking that if it's the test machinery that uses some Linux isms, that therefore the test doesn't run properly on Windows, that should be rejected for promotion. But if it's actually an underlying behavior that can't be implemented in Windows, then it gets the Linux only tag. Is that different from what you were saying?
I feel like it's different than what I was saying, but I am fine with that. I think the reason I can't adopt that policy today is because I do not have paged into my brain the thorough and exhaustive details of the Windows KEP. And there's a part of me that feels like that is a much larger review burden than the review burden of, is this a functionality that we believe is necessary to describe a Kubernetes cluster? So I partially am advocating for the opposite of that, just because I feel like it's a divide and conquer problem. Like, let's conquer does the behavior described by the test make sense to us? Yeah, that should be conformance. And then can we separately solve the problem of, but the Linux only thing is a problem?
Yeah, I think we're in violent agreement. I think we're just going through a gory detail of one thing at a time. And I think so long as they have it documented, we have a link that goes back, that gives a breadcrumb to say, like, this is why, I think that should be sufficient. This comment here, in my opinion, is not sufficient.
Right. We could have rejected this conformance even on the basis of this uses sh-cn, which is not going to work, right? But that's not the problem here. The problem here is
actually that's actually fine, the sh command, because most of the Windows images we use in testing, they're based on BusyBox, and they have that folder created.
Okay, then the other example was ping, right?
Oh yeah, ping totally behaves differently on the same.
So if we can get a link, I think that action item of getting a link to the document that outlines the delta, that would be super beneficial to update that checklist that's listed up here. Right. If we can get this in place, that will help all of us, and it'll decrease the cognitive burden, so we don't have to. Every time we ask the question, we can point to a canonical location that outlines the details.
Yeah, specifically the example of tests that aren't eligible for promotion to conformance would be really helpful to fill out. I refer to that often when I reject tests that are checking for specific events or specific reasons for things. And I ask, can we implement this a different way?
So I want to keep us on track because we got T-3 minutes, and we want to make sure that we at least get through one, and we can say what things we saw, what things we didn't see. So the first thing we definitely saw is that the version needs to be updated. We talked about potentially adding some more documentation about when we should promote things, when we should not promote things. We also talked about it definitely needs the description of why Linux only. We said that this comment is not sufficient. We'd like to ideally point to a location, which is back in this conformance document, which actually outlines the reasons why these things fail, so that way that has a good breadcrumb of information history. We agreed that this test that should be promoted, that makes a ton of sense. I wanted to go on to the next test. It's got the same comments that I had before, just to get clarification to make sure that everyone's on the same page. Create a pod within a container. Container's output is recorded in the log, and the container exits successfully without an error. When the container is terminated, terminate message must have content as a container succeeded. It's basically the opposite of the other test. It seems reasonable to me. I do think the implementation details of the mounted file mechanism seems a little. I do think that should be part of Kubernetes, in my opinion.
Well, but I mean, what you're saying is that Kubernetes is taking a dependency on using files as an IPC mechanism between a container and the node. And we could always change that and say we want to use something else. I mean, gRPC, for example.
Yeah, it could be something, but I do think the overall behavior of reporting, like we could change it from logs to like reporting, should be there, right? Last but not least, a container pod. Create a pod with end container. Again, this drives me. Container's output is recorded in the file, and the container exits successfully without an error. When the container is terminated, terminates message must watch with the context from the file. I don't have any problem with that. So the main things we saw were basically details that we already pointed out. Is there anything else that anyone else noticed?
It's kind of hidden, but the images, this is using the BusyBox image, so this is fine. So if there is a new image being introduced, then we should make sure that it's a multi-arc image and it's available across.
Okay, we got T-minus like 30 seconds. Is there any last comments folks would like to make with regards to this review? I think we have plenty of action items to follow up in this document. So if you haven't already signed yourself up, I know Patrick is on the list. I'm on the list, and I think we need to follow up with Brian and Clayton about what interval makes sense for burning through that backlog of needs approval. All right. Any last questions, comments, complaints, concerns? Going once.
I do, but it's a more complicated question. We talked about promoting to conformance, but is there a process the other way around?
Why don't we queue that conversation for next time? Does that seem fair?
Yeah.
Right. Last time. Going once? Twice? 3 times? Okay.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye.